Nioh is a Dark Souls-like game from Team Ninja. It follows the same formula of hacking through monsters to level up your character. However, Nioh differs a little bit from Dark Souls with a feudal Japan setting and a more fast-paced combat similar to Team Ninja's past games, Ninja Gaiden. In Nioh, you play as William, an Englishman that's being held in the Tower of London. You quickly break out and become involved in a quest to stop the yokai, which are basically Japanese demons. It's honestly not the most interesting story in the world. The characters are pretty boring, the dialogue is really weak, there's just nothing gripping here at all. It's barely passable enough to keep you going, really. Gameplay-wise is where Nioh makes a ton of improvements over Dark Souls. It's still the same crushing gameplay as Dark Souls where you fight through monsters to gain money that you can then use to purchase new abilities and level up. Nioh expands upon the combat of Dark Souls games in an incredibly in-depth system of combos and special abilities that feels more in common with a hack and slash game than Dark Souls. You get to choose between special abilities, magic and samurai skills, not to mention the choice between swords, dual swords, spears, axes, and kusamarigmas. You also get bows and finally rifles to use as ranged weapons. Now what I really love is how each weapon has a different feel to it. Forgive me, I'm terrible at pronouncing this, but the kusamarigma feels very weighted, the sword is very precise but slow range, spears have longer range, and each weapon can be used in different modes like slow, medium, and high. And each of these modes can completely change the way a weapon is used. For example, the Kusarigma has a mode which is more of an area attack, and there's also a slower but heavy damage, more single target focused. Swords work very much the same way in their modes. You have a more high damage but slower attack, or a quicker but lower damage attack. And where all this gets really awesome is that there's a ton of skills that you can unlock, which unlock different combos and abilities that can make your attacks more interesting or devastating. And then you can get ninja abilities like throwing ninja stars or throwing a smoke bomb to disorient an enemy. And then there's more magical abilities that you can use. And unlike Dark Souls, you don't stick with a weapon for the entire game, you loot new weapons as you go that have different abilities and properties added on to them. Nioh can't be praised enough for how awesome the customization in this game is. There's so much choice here, and there's so much replayability as a result, because you can play in all sorts of different ways and switch up different weapons and so forth. However, despite all the customization options, Nioh really falls apart when it comes to enemy variety. Throughout the game's 20 plus hours to complete it, you'll be fighting the same demons and skeletons and humans over and over and over with little variety, which gets so boring. And it's a shame because I was really loving and digging Nioh so much for the first 5 to 10 hours of this game. But about midway through, I was like, really? We're fighting the same enemies again? From a boss standpoint, this game is both good and bad. There's a lot of really unique bosses, and there was very clearly a lot of effort put into trying to make them. However, they just don't have that same epic feeling of Dark Souls. Graphically, Nioh is a mixed bag. First off, I have to praise the graphical options in this game. You can choose basically if you want to play with better graphics but lower FPS, or more FPS but less graphics, which is really cool in a game like this where every frame can count when you're trying to dodge enemies. But despite the awesome graphical options, this game looks worse than many later PS3 releases. It's muddy, it's boring, the textures lack any flair to them, and worst of all, the game does so much reusing of graphical assets. You'll be fighting the same hills, buildings, and terrain for the game's daunting 20 plus hours of gameplay. And this game has a ridiculous obsession with caves. After Nioh, I never want to see a cave again because these are just so boring looking, and they are used constantly in the game. Overall, Nioh isn't a bad game, but it's not very good either. It's just average. It makes great advances over the Dark Souls formula with more interesting combat and customization, however it really drops the ball when it comes to graphics, story, and the reusing of assets constantly, and the lack of enemy variety. Nioh gets a 7 out of 10. I'd highly recommend anyone looking into this game to wait for a sale. It's a great game in many regards, but it also has a lot that's holding it back.